Good day. Welcome to another episode of Local Government Matters. Today, we are discussing a particular component of the Municipal Finance Management Act, which is supply chain management. We don't want to create the impression that the MFMA is only about supply chain management. It is not. It is fundamentally about managing the resources of a municipality wisely. But if you do want to have a better sense of the MFMA as a whole, there was a fascinating discussion between Johan Mettler and Jan Hutting from National Treasury on that. And we encourage you to go back to listen to that if you'd like to. A major part of managing municipal finance, though, is supply chain management, because procurement is linked to supply chain management. And without procurement, there are no municipal services that can be delivered. And this is where the major challenges have been, including the important role of accounting officers in managing the finances of a municipality. And what we want to discuss today is really assessing the unintended consequences of the MFMA and its supply chain management regime, understanding how the laws meant to protect municipalities can end up stifling them, and exploring the fine line between governance and bureaucracy and fear-based management, fear-based administration. In that respect, we've got two people who bear the scars in terms of their experiences. They are veterans in this industry, and they have a lot to share. And they've been at the coalface. I'd like to introduce Rio Zitamani, who is currently the Chief Operations Officer and effectively a Deputy City Manager at the City of Tshwane. And of course, the City Manager of Tshwane, Johan Mettler. Can I hand over to you just to say hello and introduce yourselves again? Let's start with Vuyo.
Good evening, everyone. As it has been said, my name is Vuyo Zite. I've been part of local government since the transitional phase, which is way back in 1997. I hope that through this conversation, one will be able to share her own experiences and probably some suggestions as to how do we navigate our way through the MFMA whilst we have an obligation to deliver services to our citizens. Thanks.
Johan.
Good day to everybody listening. Johan Mettler. I've been in the system, local government system, since 1995. Started out there as a researcher for the chairperson of the portfolio committee then, Praveen Kordan. And I was consulting as well, and I've managed 3 cities, and I've been an administrator in 2 localities. So yes, I've been around and I've seen the best, but I've also seen the worst. And I'm very happy. I'm very happy to share the little bit that I know. Thanks, Ashwat.
In that case, let's start off with maybe the theory part of the MFMA. What was it designed to do? How was it expected to safeguard municipal governance? Can you walk us through the intended life cycle of a procurement decision under the MFMA rules? And where did the logics of the system start to diverge from its original? How did the practice of the system or the implementation of the system start to diverge from its original logic? Can I start with you, Vuyo? Or do you want me to start with Johan?
Let's start with Johan.
Okay, Johan.
Okay. Look, the MFMA really was designed to firstly bring together all of the rules and regulations relating to financial management in local government. So that was the first thing. But the second thing, importantly, it was also designed to set aside for each component, the political component and the administrative component, what their roles and responsibilities were in respect of all the facets. And in respect of procurement, for example, it draw a very clear distinction between the role of the administration and the role of the politicians, role of council. So council's role was really to agree on the plan, to agree on the budget, to implement that plan, and then to take note of the service delivery and budget implementation plan, which was more of an executive part that brought together the mayoral committee and the administration. So it was then very clear guidelines, or not guidelines, very clear prescriptions to say that when it comes to the execution of supply chain management, no councillor shall be involved in that process. Just very briefly, I think where things started to divert from the original logic, I think that was it. It was when there was a contestation between the administrative component and the political component, because what you do when you
Already, yeah.
set, what happens when you set apart those roles and responsibilities, you are also inadvertently interfering in an economy that has been going for quite a while. So whilst we had the rules, there was also then the practice also of interests that still wanted to find expression within that system. So we then made more rules in order to deal with that. And of course, the more rules you make for irregular expenditure, for fruitless and wasteful expenditure as a result of improper decisions in terms of the MFMA, then you also then create a minefield of compliance where if you're the good guys, then the bad guys come after you to say you did not cross that T, and for not crossing that T, we're coming after you. So I think that's principally where it went wrong.
Vuyo, do you have anything to add?
Like just over and above what Johan has indicated, remember MFMA, including PFMA for that matter, is a product of the Constitution. I think especially Section 215. And my view is that the Act was aimed at giving effect to the constitutional provision of ensuring that all spheres of government, including local government, when they are managing their affairs, financial affairs especially, they should do that in a transparent and accountable manner. So that is the historical context of where the MFMA is coming from. And mainly, as Johan has said, it's there to provide a sound financial governance framework that will clarify roles and responsibilities from the council, the mayor to the accounting officer, as well as the CFO and other senior managers within the institution. I strongly believe as well that there's a correlation between sustainable service delivery and sound financial management. If you properly manage your finances, you are guaranteed that you are going to use those finances towards delivering the basic services that are much needed in our communities. So it was to create a framework to make sure that there's financial governance in the local government sphere.
Thank you. That brings us perfectly to the next area, and that is many people argue that the supply chain management component really adds to governance paralysis and performance loss. How does the MFMA complexity impact on the speed and decisiveness of service delivery? Are we seeing a shift from governance to compliance, with creativity punished and risk aversion rewarded? And does the MFMA create more control or more dysfunction in reality? Vuyo?
It's more of control, I would say so, with very little flexibility. And I will use an example here. With this recent judgment, I think it's a Supreme Court judgment of Mbambisa, the MFMA is going to inhibit us in making quick decisions, even balancing decisions. And I'll articulate an example. In one of the municipalities, I was faced with a contradiction. I get into this institution, there's a project which has been stopped because there was an issue with the consultant. The contractor then was forced to move off-site because there was no scope to extend the contract of the consultant because it had reached the threshold of 15% of the variation. Now, if there is no consultant on site, it means the contractor is not going to be there. Now, what this means is that decision makers did not want to perpetuate irregular expenditure. because there was no justifiable reason why the threshold was exceeded, though there were compelling reasons at the time, whether they were justified or not. But on one hand, if you don't have a contractor on site, the institution has to pay what is called standing time on a daily basis until the dispute or the impasse or whatever inhibits progress on site is resolved. Now, when I looked at the value of the standing time, which I construed to be fruitless expenditure, it far outweighed the value of the extension that we needed for that contract, which was about 3% above the threshold. Now, I was caught up with a decision because I don't want to be associated with non-compliant expenditure as to whether I should bite the bullet, extend this contract because there was value that would have accrued to the institution and save the institution millions of fruitless expenditure. So I am saying that with the current legislation and the recent case law, I took a decision at that time that I'm not going to incur fruitless expenditure because that expenditure that is in vain, there's no value that is accrued to the institution. I will bite the bullet and rather go and face whoever I have to face to explain the irregular expenditure because I can point that there is value that is created. Now, the case law that we have does not even consider Section 72 that says that you may incur irregular expenditure, and that decision only if that decision was made in good faith, because now that case law requires us to pay any money that relates to non-compliant expenditure. So I am saying it's an enabler on one hand, because we want efficiencies, we want transparency, we want accountability. But on the other hand, it doesn't make provision for cases like the one that I've just made an example, where really you would rather go for irregular expenditure than fruitless expenditure.
Ashraf, I can,
Yeah.
if I can come in here, I can confirm that as we all know, life is not perfect. Nothing happens exactly as you plan. And often one is called upon as a senior administrative leadership to make a value call, to make a judgment call, to say in the greater scheme of things, this is what needs to happen. And you have examples of what people would refer to as evergreen contracts. It's not really an evergreen contract. The examples are when you on a 15, you put the scope that the consultant has laid out is over a period of at least 15 years because you are now constructing major infrastructure, let's say wastewater infrastructure. But you can only do a contract over 3 years. So this is 5 times 3 years that you would need to enter into a contract, and questions are then being asked later on. And then the consultant would fall away, but then you need to get another consultant. So there are those kind of choices. But there are also cases where there's legitimate governance action. For example, council says there is a Section 154 assistance coming. We need to appoint somebody, and they make a decision. Council actually makes the decision as we appoint that person. X must come. And when you speak to X, X says, no, I can come, but you must please appoint me through my company because this is only a 3-month contract or a 6-month contract. In other words, I can't resign from my company and then expect to go back in 6 months' time. So in order to then execute legitimate governance action as a council decision, you would then go on a restricted procurement, and you say there's a good reason why I'm appointing this person because council says this person must be appointed because it's a national Section 154 intervention. And then you get the case where you have to make out the case through the supply chain. But I want to add in something here. Then you also get bad faith actors that will hold that decision potentially against you, and it has happened, where they would say, you have now transgress the rules. This is irregular. Nobody said you must appoint company X. We said we had to appoint person X, not company X. So sometimes the supply chain rules are then abused in order to block legitimate governance action in that example that I've just given you. And it's a real life example. Ashraf?
Yeah. Which is why sure, come in where?
Boss, I just want to make an example from the perspective that SCM is stringently applied. It really doesn't encourage innovation, but I know I'm equally aware that innovation can be exploited. I always make an example of the relationship that we have with BMW. We are at pains as the city of Tshwane in finding a solution which is cost effective and yet effective to secure our assets. We've done an assessment and estimation of how much is needed, and it runs to millions and millions of rands, which we cannot afford at this stage. Now, out of the relationship that we have with the industry, and in particular BMW, they made an offer to the city to say, listen here, we cannot continue with this power disruption simply because you cannot protect your assets. Let's get into a partnership where we will roll out our security infrastructure to those assets that feed the supply into the Roslyn area at our own cost. Allow us to do a security assessment, and then we'll do an estimation, and then we'll talk to our principals and provide that security so that we have consistent supply of power. They did an assessment, they came back. You will not believe, to protect and using first-class security technology to protect that entire network, which is quite significant, it cost them 400,000. Yet, when we go out onto the market, your providers of services and goods, they determine the market price to the detriment of the institution. Now, if I did not have MFMA and the SCM, a simple thing that I would do would be to get into a partnership with BMW and say, please make use of the same service providers, extend the security infrastructure that you have to cover Kwafa and any other high-risk asset that we have at 75% less than we would get from the market. So I'm saying that probably the reviewers of the legislation really need to consider grounds for deviation, because I strongly believe that if you have a strong business case where you can prove that you can get the goods or services at far less the price, same quality or even better quality, we should be allowed to make those decisions. Now, I can't roll out infrastructure because the quotation that I have of a similar technology is 100% more than what I can get it for if I were to get into a simple partnership with BMW. So it's those little things that really need, but I know, I'm fully aware that the risk is that we can exploit the same flexibility, because it's not everyone who is honest and who really has an integrity that cannot be questioned in local government.
Especially since that, despite the regulations, there have still been people who have grown their local economies, as Johan called it.
Yes.
The local economy means corrupt activities to steal money from the system. So, which brings me to the point of the weaponization of the SCM. We deliberately calling this session the MFMA as a Petard. And so when we say that, what do we mean when we say that the supply chain management has been weaponized, legal and audit risks made officials too fearful to act? You just given an example of the BMW situation. Can you share an example where SCM rules were used to block legitimate governance action? Let's start with Johan, and then we'll come to Vuyo again.
Yes, I have in the previous segment given an example of a decision that had to be executed, a legitimate decision, and the procurement that followed was then was then used by actors within the municipality who did not want stability, who certainly did not want good governance, then to turn it around, to turn it on its head, to say that is not a legitimate deviation. Although the case was made out, in fact, the irony was at one stage, although even the Public Accounts Committee was of that municipality even did not deal with that item because they needed it they needed it for it to be unresolved, that they in the end had to agree that it was legitimate. So certainly the threat of bad faith oversight, I want to call it, that threat is there. And one can't legislate good faith. The law assumes that all of the actors within the system will act with good faith. But that is not so when you are in environments where you and myself have found ourselves. The reasons why we end up in certain situations is that the bad faith actors are running the roost. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, an American legal philosopher, famously said that the bad man knows the law. So the bad man knows exactly what it is that must be complied with and where there's an argument to be made, and they will find that, and they will then use that. So we have seen that in instances where we want to save money, as we has indicated, there's also the example of having to justify why you go to newspapers directly instead of going through a middleman. Now we want to cut out the middleman because the middleman or the middle person, let me not assume it's always a man, although it is mostly, but the middleman is there to inflate prices. That's a consequence. Maybe I shouldn't say that they're so harsh about it, but certainly there's that consequence. You pay more. But when you have newspapers that you can go to, you want to advertise, nothing should stop you from going directly to the newspapers to say we want to advertise there instead of going through somebody that will facilitate that and now find the best price for you. Yet you find yourself that you, in order to avoid any scrutiny and possible liability, that you just go that route of the middleman instead of going to the original equipment manufacturer, as we would call them. So there is then that shift that I think that we then tend to make things a bit more complex than what they would need to be. And you do find yourself that you take much longer in dealing with procurement decisions. Maybe if I can just add one other thing. There's a standard that says that from the moment that you close your advertisement for a tender to when you appoint a service provider, it should be 90 days. And we seldom find ourselves within that 90 days simply because of all the checks and balances that the supply chain system has been put into place, including probity checks, because these days probity check is something that if you don't do it, you are risking your neck.
Yeah.
So when it comes to big tenders, security, for example, you have hundreds of bidders, and you must probably check each and every single one of them. That takes you easily 3 to 4 months just for the probity check. Now you can imagine you add that to your 90 days, and then you find yourself in a situation where you have to extend an existing contract. Nobody wants to extend an existing contract. Anything can go wrong. So we really got ourselves into it, trying to comply, but also wanting to make sure that the system has integrity, that you can rely on the outcomes, and then service delivery actually gets delayed, and that's an unfortunate consequence of all of these rules. Anyway, yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah.
Before I hand over to Buyo, I think what you said also raises the other point that if you try and extend the contract, you create more risks for yourself because you get the 15%, you've got the limitations to which an extent a contract can be extended. Then you also have the accusations against yourself. So you actually increase your risk if you try to extend the contract as a result of the inefficiencies of the advertising limitations and things. So, Avoyo, I'm sure you have a lot
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. Though I don't have a specific example that I can make, but the local government environment has changed in the last 10 years. One has to be extremely cautious, and I agree with the city manager that the only bulletproof is that before you make a decision, make sure that it goes to the pre-audit or probate, whatever you call it, so that when you put your hand, your signature there, at least you would be seen that you had applied your mind, and on the basis of the advice coming from an independent office, you had to make that decision. In reality, in this day and age, MPEC is used as a tool to patch certain people. You would find that the reports that we take there, they are not considered in good faith all the time. They are actually used to get people out of the system deliberately. So one has to be extra cautious when it comes to supply chain policies. But then again, you need to find a creative way. And one of the things that I've been trying to advocate, unfortunately, I'll have to make COT as a reference point, is to have your framework contracts, framework consultants, or term contracts that we have on the database, so that the decision-making process, you do the pre-qualification, which is going to take a lot of time. But once you have those service providers having been vetted and having gone through the quality assurance process of selection, you can then work on a quotation system, which then enhances your turnaround time. Yeah, SCM in this day and age, one has to be extra cautious. But at the same time, I don't think we should be in limbo simply because we fear that these decisions may be used against us. There are cities like the city of Cape Town. They use the same prescripts, but they are creative in how they use those prescripts. They have checks and balances, and I'm aware that they are using framework contracts and consultants and term tenders. Hence, they have clean audits. So we should not be threatened by other dubious agendas. We should find creative ways that are still compliant with the law to make sure that service delivery is not compromised at the end of the day.
Yeah. So that brings us again neatly to the next segment. Can municipal leaders act with courage within the current constraints, or is reform inevitable? Are there reforms, whether they are procedural or legislative, that would help restore the balance between control and action? Action in this case would be service delivery. And are the existing municipalities that are navigating the MFMA intelligently, as you just explained, the city of Cape Town, and what are they doing differently that could serve as lessons for our listeners? So let's start with you, Vuyo. Or do you want me to start with Johan? Okay, Johan.
And
Look, I do think that clearly there are existing municipalities that are navigating the MFMA intelligently. We've had a very interesting discussion with West Coast, for example, and I'm sure that they won't mind me saying that or me mentioning that. And they place a lot of emphasis on training, on having quick access to SCM experts. They make sure that their committees are fully capacitated in the sense that they are frequently updated on any new developments, any new case law, so that when they are confronted with decisions, that they can make those decisions within the framework of the law, but also knowing full well the space that they have in which to make those decisions. So it's definitely possible to get the environment. So I don't think that's an issue. I do, however, want to emphasize that good faith is a component of that. You have to trust those around you. That MM can trust the recommendations that come from the BAC. In other jurisdictions, the municipal manager must literally run through the entire process again to make sure that he or she can sign on the dotted line. So I do think that acting with courage, you can only act with courage if you have absolute faith in your system.
Yeah.
That's the cold hard reality. And I think that we are seeing that one cannot always depend on that system giving you the best results. A simple example is when municipalities are faced with contractors that simply can't do the job, but they come through a supply chain process, and yet you have complied with everything, but they simply cannot do the job. Why can't they do the job? Because nobody bothered to check the track record.
Yeah.
So I do think that when it comes to the rules, yes, it should be possible to act, but I do think also that reform is needed. If you have a system that you have shown consistently that you are compliant, you are managing all of your risks, you have very little any irregular expenditure or fruitless and wasteful expenditure, then I do think that there should be a reform that will allow you a bit more leeway. That will say you are performing well, you are showing that you have the capacity to implement, and therefore you can now make decisions with regard to, let's say, a free quote system, let's say up to 10 million rand if you are a metro, because you have shown that you can perform. You have shown that your systems can be depended on. So I do think that consistently good performance must be rewarded, and I think the reform must start taking that into consideration. When it comes to balancing between control and action, I do think that differentiation on that basis and on other bases must come into play. It cannot be the same rules for everybody, so that you actually say, what's the lowest common denominator? The lowest common denominator is that everyone is corrupt. Then you're going to have a very difficult system. And I don't think that would be fair. For you, do you have some additions?
There's Tazas not far from us. They spend 100% of their budget. They have had in audits consistently. They achieve their service delivery milestones with ease. At the center of everything, there is people. And once you compromise the quality of the people that you have in your system, you are going to have problems. Number two, Johan has spoken about a system starting with the policy, standard operating procedures, and I would dare say that even an automated system of supply chain, because once you reduce the human interface, the probability of tampering with the system so that it gives you the desired end result is very minimal. So from where I am sitting is that you need a little bit of control. That control, though, should be an enabler rather than an inhibitor. The example that I just made about framework contractors and framework consultants comes directly from the Western Cape government. In fact, it emerged out of the engagement that we had with West Coast. And we had to get advocate, Helen? Is it Handa? I can't remember. Fender or something like, to develop 100% compliant specification for framework contractors and framework consultants, which she did, and that we submitted internally with the aim of having a watertight system, a compliant supply system that is acceptable in law. Till to date, it's 4 months later, that tender has not gone out. Why? Because there's a human interface, there's an interest. Somebody knows that immediately you have framework contractors, you will not have a room of manipulating the system. So I am saying that it's a number of factors. It's the people, it's the competences of those people, but also it's the organizational culture. We are not complying simply because we don't know what to do. It's the culture of the organization. And once the culture is defined from the top, which is the case in the city of Tshwane, we'll not have problems of non-compliance. We'll not see SCM as an inhibitor. Instead, we'll see it as an enabler, as long as we apply these innovative methods that will assist us in making decisions which are watertight, which are compliant as well. So I'm saying people, culture, systems are very important.
Okay. I think that's a very important point that you make on culture as well. Yes. So if we look ahead, we've raised the challenges, we've raised the problems, we've raised the risks. We've seen that certain municipalities can take the cumbersome system and make it work in some way or the other. But what's very interesting is that the MFMA is the only piece of municipal specific legislation that has not been amended as a result of lessons from practice. The Demarcation Act has been amended. In fact, there's a new Demarcation Act. There's the Systems Act that has been amended. The Structures Act has been amended. And it's the MFMA that still needs to be relooked at. If the MFMA were to be reimagined today, what principles would you suggest needs to guide it? How do we protect against corruption without building a system of paralysis, as we seem to have at the moment? And what advice, and this is for me the most important concluding part, what advice would you give to young municipal managers on how to lead responsibly and not just compliantly? Let's start with Leo.
Can I come in?
Yes, yes.
I had an engagement on this similar issue not long ago. Can I start by saying a municipality should be defined as a business enterprise? Do we all agree?
Yep.
It's a business enterprise. For a municipality to survive, it must generate revenue. And once you generate revenue, you are able to deliver services. And I want to draw an analysis from the PFMA. If you look at water boards and how they are structured, they are Schedule 3B institutions. They are subjected to the same PFMA and to the same SCM practices, but with a degree of flexibility. They are exempted from certain regulations, like the 14-day period of advertising. They are given 7 days and a number of other exemptions that they are given, because it is understood that in their nature, they are supposed to sell a service. They are supposed to deliver a service for them to generate revenue. So I am saying, in as far as the MFMA review is concerned, probably we can draw some lessons on how your Schedule 3B institutions are structured. The second aspect is accountability. We will be naive if we think that councillors 100% exempted from corruption. We will be naive, and I'm sure all of us were aware. But unfortunately, the way the legislation is structured based on the roles and responsibility, that responsibility or consequence management for that matter applies to officials, because councillors are not part of the decision-making process. Again, if I try and correlate that to a Schedule 3B, the Schedule 3B is very clear, but unfortunately with municipalities, we have accounting officers, and in Schedule 3B, you have heads of departments or CEOs. They are not necessarily accounting officers. But I'm saying the same principle, they are accounting authorities. If anything goes wrong in a Schedule 3B institution, it's not only the CEO that is answerable. The entire board is answerable. And I'm saying, if there's one area, if I were to make a suggestion as to how can we enhance MFMA, I would really say that the responsibility of accounting for whatever goes wrong or for whatever type of non-compliant expenditure, the entire mayoral committee must take full responsibility. That will be the day that corruption stops in this institution. Once they know that they will be accountable for the decisions that are made within the administration. I'm not sure whether this makes sense, but I'm saying really this matter of absolving councillors simply because they are now part of the decision making. Sewari, probably we should enhance their role by enhancing their oversight responsibility, but at the same time ensuring that they take full responsibility for whatever goes wrong in the institution, and that should not be limited to officials only.
Ashraf,
Before I hand over to Johan, on that one, I'm going to at the end ask you to give the last word, and that would be the advice to a young municipal manager on how to lead responsibly.
Oh, okay.
All
right,
but I'll give you that at the end. Johan, over to you, and you can also just address that when you come.
Yes. Look, it is so that there are certain principles that underpins the current system and practice. We've got 22 years of practice. So that is in 2003. So we've got 23 years of practice that we can now reflect on. And we now know how economies work within the broader government, also within local government, that officials take certain officials or some officials do take instructions, politicians, whether they are in executive, wherever they are. But that does happen. So we must learn from that and say that there is, and I agree with you, that there must be an accountability built in. Also, when it comes to protecting against corruption and avoiding paralysis, there would need to be, as I argued earlier, a fair degree of differentiation between not only categories of municipalities, but also differentiation based on performance, that you actually perform to an extent that will allow you to have more freedom. That balanced against the idea that WU has posited that in order for municipalities to become more competitive and more agile, they would need to be able to make decisions fast, and that would have to be built into the system. So it's not so the system should not say what is the lowest common denominator. The system must say what is it that would need to be achieved, and have you achieved that, then you qualify for a higher level of responsibility and a greater degree of choice that you would have. I would just tell a young, if you do one thing, do only this one thing. Surround yourself with ethical, competent, experienced peer people around you. Integrity. Because intelligence without integrity is havoc. Thank you for your listening.
My last word to a young municipal manager, the fact that that individual would be occupying that position means that he or she has what it takes. And that person must never, ever allow any kind of political pressure to compromise his integrity and reputation. Because once it is gone, it's very difficult to pick it. People should be bold enough to say no, even if that no comes with pain at a particular point in time. No matter how long that takes, one would be redeemed and you would stand tall with your integrity and reputation in one piece.
And there we go. Thank you very much. If you want to lead successfully, if you want to deliver service successfully using the supply chain management regulations and the requirements of the Municipal Finance Management Act, surround yourself with good people, people with integrity, conduct yourself with integrity, and make sure that the service delivery is always in the forefront. And there's something that I've learned when I always knew this intuitively, but Johan mentioned this once when we were dealing with organizational culture at Tshwane municipality, that we are entrusted by the people to take care of the resources and to manage them carefully and it's only with integrity that we can do that. So young municipal managers, lead with integrity and surround yourself with people who have integrity. Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Vuyo. This has been another wonderful conversation, and I'm glad that we're able to share this with with the people in the local government ecosystem. Take care.